here already, so we'll get started, and I'll start the introductions. Welcome everybody to this panel discussion featuring actually three children's book illustrators. One is the moderator, Seo Kim, and we have Melissa Iwai and Katie Yamasaki. And before I turn the program over to our guests, I want to mention that this is a program organized by the Asian Arts and Culture Center and the Career Center and the Towson University Animation Industry Club. And many of you know, but many of you might know that the Asian Arts and Culture Center, we live here in the Center for the Arts, and we are a self-support department of Towson University. So we want to thank many people for making this happen. As a self-support department, we depend on donations and grants and all kinds of funding to keep our programs going. So I want to do a shout out to several people for this. And it will be the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Maryland State Arts Council, the William G. Baker Jr. Memorial Fund, Yoshinobu and Kathleen Shiota, the citizens of Baltimore County, the Asian Arts and Culture members and donors, the Towson University College of Fine Arts and Communication, Robert Mintz and Beth Arman, Anthony and Bonnie Montcalmo, Connie Rosemont and John Greenberg, the Harold J. Kaplan Foundation, the Deb Jaden Kylie Keelty Foundation, the TU Asian Studies and Interdisciplinary Studies Program, the Baltimore Kawasaki Sister City Committee. And let's see. We also need your help in reviewing this program so we can tell our supporters how well we're doing. So if you could complete this survey when the program finishes, there's a QR code up here, and then I think we have it on a paper sign out in the corridor when the program's done. After this program, we'll have a reception and a book signing and sale with our artists. So please, you can go back out to the Asian Arts Atrium and enjoy that. And of course, look at the exhibition. This talk goes with an exhibition that we have outside the Asian Arts and Culture Center Gallery in our vitrines. And it's a mini exhibition, children's book art by Japanese American illustrators. And the artwork is done by Melissa and Katie. And that show complements our bigger show in the Asian Arts Gallery. I don't know if you've seen it yet, but it is Dream Refuge for Children Imprisoned. And that's an installation by Naomi Judy Shitani. And it reflects the experiences of imprisoned children, particularly children who were imprisoned in Japanese concentration camps after World War II. But it also involves stories of Native Americans who are separated from their families, and Central American children who are separated from their families at the border, the southern U.S. border. I would also like to let you know that we have a couple other events coming up. We have some films that we're doing in partnership with Baltimore Kawasaki Sister City. They're Japanese films on March 16th, May 18th, and July 20th. And keep your eyes open for the activities of our Asian North Festival in Station North in Baltimore City, and that begins on May 3rd. So now I'm going to introduce our panelists. There's Melissa Iwai, and she's an award-winning children's book author and illustrator of over 30 books. Her I Can Read Gigi and Ojiji series chronicles the developing relationship between Gigi, a biracial Asian American girl, and her grandfather Ojiji. Dumplings for Lily, Soup Day, and Pizza Day celebrate the joy of cooking with family and community. And she earned her BA from Santa Cruz, an MA, Santa Cruz, that's UC Santa Cruz, and an MA from Stanford University, and a BFA from Art Center College of Design. And we have Katie on the other end, and she's a muralist and children's book artist. Her work focuses on themes of identity, social justice, and stories from underrepresented communities, and she leads teaching art. She's a lead teaching artist for Expressive Arts program she helped develop at a maximum security prison for women in upstate New York. She has her BA from Earlham College and MFA from the School of Visual Arts in New York City. And finally, our moderator is our own Towson University's professor, Seo Kim, and she has her MFA in illustration practice from Maryland Institute College of Art, which we all know as MICA. And her research focuses on illustrating children's books that celebrate cultural diversity. Her most recent book, A Map into the World, was selected as one of the best picture books of 2019 by Kirkus Reviews. And her upcoming picture book, Baba's Peach Tree, is scheduled for publication with Random House Studio for spring 2024. Now we're going to have two short presentations, one by Melissa, one by Katie, and then Seo will take over as the moderator.
Oh, you have to. Yeah, do you need your... Oh, yeah. What's going on? Gosh, we did... We're delete them. Maybe to reset. Sorry, we ran through this and it worked. Okay. Okay, I can just do the PowerPoint. Did you try up here? Yeah. I mean, from our... Is anybody well versed in doing presenter mode on this computer?
You have to,
Go ahead.
you have to mirror it.
I'm in this room all the time presenting, so I can try it. Okay, and then getting it onto the screen.
You mirror it.
That part, is it not on Notion right now? Yeah. So sorry.
There.
Okay. Okay. Almost. Oh, you need some
Well,
Just swap the display. So if you just play from the beginning, what happens?
that's it, right there.
No, it's still there. So go back. You know what, I have these notes on my iPhone. This is through Keynote. Yeah, but I can just go through it without the notes and have my iPad. Yeah. Is there not PowerPoint? I have a PowerPoint. I don't think it's still on your customized. I have a PowerPoint version. We have the PowerPoint. Yeah, let's just, maybe just do that. You just do that. You'll find your art. Yeah, that's probably the easiest. The PowerPoint. Yeah. If you need a presenter, you go find. Oh, you need my iPad. Your iPad. Okay. If the PowerPoint is already downloaded. Yeah, it is, but it is downloaded. I think we downloaded it. And we downloaded it. You can save it as a PowerPoint. TU Animation Club.
Yes.
So not everyone here is a TU student, so please let us know what it is that you do.
Yes. So at the TU Animation Industry Club, we try to introduce students to the art of animation by trying to go over the various job positions in the animation industry. So each week we'll try to go over a job position, such as like maybe one week we'll cover character design, next week we'll cover like storyboarding or writing workshop, or like for instance this Friday we're doing a storyboard workshop. So definitely come by if you would like to learn how to storyboard, kind of like how the Simpsons way. We'll be making packets and passing that out. Anybody who wants to participate. Yes, and also we're working with a career center. So if anybody who is passionate about wanting to get into the industry, we're kind of working with them as like a second career center sort of situation we're doing.
Oh my God.
All right.
You have it?
Yes, the PowerPoint gods are back.
Thank you. Yeah, no problem.
Okay, thank you for your patience, everyone. I promise you did test this. I don't know what happened, but thank you for being patient and understanding. And thank you so much for making it out tonight to be here. And thank you to the Asian Arts and Culture Center. It's on. Okay, I just need to clip it there. For inviting Katie and me to this, to share our work with you tonight and be part of this amazing exhibition. I highly recommend seeing you all to see the installation. It's really powerful. We just saw it before coming here. So just a little bit about myself. Okay. Oh no, is this clear enough? These are some of my books. I've been working as an author illustrator of children's books for 25 years now, and sometimes when I think of it, I'm honestly surprised that I've illustrated so many books, and I've written 7 because I've just always wanted to be an author illustrator ever since I was a kid. It always was like my dream job, and I was an early reader. I always loved to draw, and books were like an emotional refuge for me because I was a really anxious, shy, really timid kid, and meeting strangers terrified me. I don't know what I would have done without my books. So you can say that these books and their beautiful art gave me a way to escape into a world where I felt secure and comforted and in control. And inspired by favorite books of mine, I started making my own mini picture books when I was 6 or 7. But my path making this my career was definitely not direct, and you may be surprised, but so many authors and illustrators come to it later in life. They could have different careers, or maybe they came into it from a career in publishing, but we're just all connected by our passion for wanting to tell stories with our pictures and words. In my case, while making art was always my joy when I was a little kid all the way up to college, for some reason a flip switched when I was around many of your age when I was around early 20s, I guess. And I just got it in my head. I don't know whether it was societal pressures or fear or self-doubt, but I just felt like I couldn't make a living as an artist, and I had to get serious and I had to get a real job. So I changed course and I started studying languages and linguistics and East Asian studies, and I spent my time studying Japanese and going to Japan and working in Japan, and then I eventually went to graduate school for linguistics. And in grad school, I thought I was being an adult and not indulging in fantasies, and I tried really hard to focus on my studies, which was in Japanese phonology and language change. But it was then that this old passion of mine really started to grow. And after being in graduate school for a while, I realized, things are just as uncertain in academia. So I decided to just take a leap of faith, and I dropped out of grad school and enrolled in the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, where I finally had the opportunity to just immerse myself in learning everything I could about art. And I got my BFA in illustration, and then I moved to New York City because that's where all the publishers are. And I was told it would take twice as long to make it if I stayed in California. So I moved to New York, and that's where I met my agent, whom I'm still with to this day. But getting my first book took a while, almost 2 years, because I had a lot of pieces in my portfolio that looked like this. This is something I did, my commentary on Barbie, when I was in art school. Now, of course, there's so many different Barbies, but back when I was a kid, there wasn't. So I had all these dark paintings of kids who my agent told me editors were saying they looked like they had black eyes. So maybe today I might get something with this more editorial look, but back then I wasn't getting anything. And more importantly, I didn't have a series of paintings in my portfolio that showed that I could tell a narrative with my illustrations. And also I didn't have anything that showed a single character in different views, that showed I could paint a character consistently. So I did a series of 4 paintings. This is one of them, and it's a story about a little girl on her way to her piano lesson in New York City on a rainy day. And I put this in my portfolio, and soon after, I got my first book, which is Makeshift Daddy, and this came out in 2000. It's written by Eileen Spinelli and told in rhyming format. It's about a dad who works the night shift, and before he goes to work, he tucks his daughter into bed, and then when he comes home the next day, she tucks him into bed. It's a really sweet story. And I wanted to mention that it's a common misconception that the author and illustrator work closely together. And in actuality, I've actually never met Eileen Spinelli. And the reason why we don't work together is because the illustrator works closely with the editor and art director. And that's to give freedom to the illustrator to create a vision of what we see as the story. And that's one of my favorite things about being an illustrator, because we're not expected to just paint exactly what the text is, because how boring would that be, right? So you can see in this illustration, the text is soon the winter sun goes down, shadows spill across the town, and the main characters are in the window with the white cat. And I'm just setting up the story. I made the family biracial and had it set in an urban setting, but if you just read the story, which is really just fills a page and a half, there's nothing in that says that, but I was able to bring that to the story. And she's a masterful writer, and she gives her illustrator that room in her spare text. So why is it so important for me to show different kinds of families in my books? Well, growing up, I never saw any Asian American children or people who looked like me. I had 2 books. One was the 5 Chinese Brothers, and another was an old book on Japanese folk tales, and it completely didn't reflect my life as an Asian American living in suburban California. So I've always tried to insert people with different colors or biracial families into my illustrations, even though the text doesn't necessarily mention it. This is Soup Day. It's the first book that I both wrote and illustrated, and I decided to make the main character adopted from Asia, but it's never mentioned in the text. The story is really about making soup with a child and the joy of cooking with a child, and I was inspired because I was trying to get my son to eat vegetables, and he would do it if he cooked with me. So there's nothing about adoption in the story, but it's really nice because when I sometimes at book events or book festivals, I've been approached by people who have adopted kids, and they appreciate being seen in the story, and they're the only ones that catch that the girl is adopted. And because this was the first book that I wrote and illustrated, the process was different from illustrating someone else's story, because I knew I would be creating the illustrations. I would go back and forth in my mind between the words and the pictures. So there were certain images I knew I wanted to incorporate, so I would write that in the text, and then other times I wrote the words first, and then thought of how to illustrate the scene. And I continue to work using this approach with my more recent books. This is Dumplings for Lily, and it's about a girl living in a tall apartment building with 6 grandmas making dumplings from their respective cultures. And Lily helps complete their dumpling making by finding the right ingredient for them. And before I even started writing this story, I sketched and painted a lot of various dumplings and dumpling making tools. And I had to decide which ones to include because I knew I wanted 6. And there's so many dumplings in the world to choose from, right? So I just chose the most diverse ones with, in terms of the shape and the size and the flavor, texture. And I did a lot of sketches of different grandmas and researched what the different word for grandma is in different languages. I also had to keep in mind what the recipes in the story would be for each dumpling and what ingredient the different cuisines could share so that it would make sense that a different grandma would have the same ingredient. Here's a snippet of my sketchbook where I'm drawing the dummy thumbnails and trying to figure out the story at the same time. I think here I'm trying to figure out the order of which grandma she visits based on where they live in the building and what ingredient they need. And so this visual of the tall building and Lily running up and down the stairs is inspired by buildings in New York. I took tours of the Tenement Museum also in New York. It's common for immigrants of different countries being neighbors in the same building in the city. And this is the opening spread, which shows each grandma in their respective kitchen and kind of sets the stage for where the story takes place, which is in this apartment building. So as I said before, I made all these illustration decisions while I was writing the story, and it was kind of a continuous back and forth between sketching and writing. And then also in the interior illustrations, I tried to incorporate a lot of information in the background that informs who the characters are. So in each of the grandma's kitchens, you can kind of get an idea of their culture. So babcha on the left, I have a lot of these brightly painted plates and the tile on her floor. That was inspired by Polish folk art and textiles. And then Abuela, she has Mexican pottery and Mexican masks in her kitchen. Nonna has an Italian espresso maker on her stove. So, is my messy workspace. It's pretty small. My paintings aren't that big. I always start my illustrations traditionally. So these are all done in watercolor and gouache. And then I scan them into the computer, and I use Photoshop, and I cut out the paintings so they're on a separate layer. Here's all the kitchen elements that are cut out, and then I put them together using the computer, kind of like a digital collage, so everything's layered together. So this is Nonna, and I painted her whole body, and then I add the features in Photoshop. So there's her face and glasses, and then this is this complete kitchen in layers. I work with hundreds and hundreds of layers, every object, and within the object, everything has its own layer. So this is a kind of what this digital collage looks like, starting from the back to the front. And then in terms of current work, my most recent venture is this I Can Read series, GGNOGG, about this little girl, Gigi. She's biracial, and her Japanese grandfather, Ojiji, comes to stay with her family. And the inspiration comes from a memory from my childhood of when my grandpa, whom we called Ojiji, came to stay with us. And I couldn't speak any Japanese, and he couldn't speak much English, even though he had lived in Hawaii for many, many years. He immigrated to Hawaii from Japan at the turn of the century, like so many Japanese people at the time. And so both of my parents were born and raised in Hawaii, in Honolulu. And they grew up during World War II. And being in Hawaii, they escaped being incarcerated, but they weren't allowed to speak Japanese in public or learn how to read and write Japanese. So they didn't pass that language down. And so my brother and I we didn't grow up hearing Japanese at all, and we couldn't speak it, obviously. So when Ojiji lived with us, it was a real challenge to communicate. So we would use a mixture of English, Japanese, Hawaiian, pidgin, and hand gestures. Somehow we made it work. But that experience made such a huge impression on me at that young age. I was about, I guess, 5, and it was the first time I interacted with somebody who wasn't a native speaker of English. And also, he seemed so different from other grandfathers I'd see on TV or in books, because he wouldn't hug, and he just seemed very old. So this I Can Read format presented a very different challenge for me. I don't know if you know these books. I Can Read is the series with HarperCollins, and basically they're leveled readers, and they're for emergent readers who are learning how to read on their own, and they're different levels, and each level is very specific about how many words that can be in the story, how many words can be on the page, how many characters there can be per line, including punctuation and spaces. So for these books, I wrote the entire manuscript first, and it was more like the illustration part was more like my process for illustrating other people's stories in this sense. But while I was writing it, I referred to this thumbnail dummy layout because it served as a sort of map, because I had to figure out how many lines I had to work with within each spread. So I was thinking about what image would go there, but I was really focusing on the text. And here are some early character sketches. And then I decided to make her younger and more friendly with really exaggerated features. And I also changed the ratio of head to body sizes for all the characters. So for my pitch to my editor, I gave her a manuscript and these color character samples, as well as a finished sample from the story, and a one-line idea for other stories that I was thinking of. happily she responded with enthusiasm and she bought the series. So in all, there are 4 Gigi and OGG books, and this last one, Perfect Paper Cranes, that comes out in May. And they're all kind of about how Gigi and OGG, how their relationship deepens over time and how they teach each other about their cultures. And there's a glossary of Japanese words at the end of each book. So for me, the best thing about what I do is being able to tap into that child, my child self on a daily basis and connecting with kids on that level. So my aim has always been to create something that I would have loved to read as a kid, and I hope that my books inspire the kind of comfort that I found in my books. And I'll leave here with this 30-second condensed version of how I created the illustrations for Zen for Kids. Some of the artwork is on display here. This is an illustration of Momotaro and his friends, and it's done in the same way as those. And I did these all on my iPad using Procreate, and then transferred it to Photoshop because I told you I use a ton of layers, and I can't have enough on Procreate. But let's see. I start with the black and white sketch, and so this is me painting. That's my palette, and I'm just painting each character and layering it, and then later I do the background. I need a reference for the pheasants, and then do the background, and then add the lighting and shadow. That's it. Thank you so much. Sorry about the technical difficulties earlier. Hopefully this will just come right up.
Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out this evening. I'm so happy to be here. I'm sure my child right now is probably reading Gigi and OGG. She's a huge fan. And then when I saw that there were 4 books, I was like, wait a minute, we have 3. And then maybe we'll get the 4th. So just a little bit about me. I have been living in Brooklyn, New York for about the past 25 years, but I was born and raised in Michigan, north of Detroit, in a little factory town, born to hippies and raised very much as you might expect. I have been doing picture books for a long time. I did my MFA at the School of Visual Arts in New York City and finished in 2003, but it took me a much longer time to kind of get my books going than it did to kind of get my murals going. So I've been doing murals all these past 25 years, and I really just love to kind of use art in any way to tell a story. So I've done, I think at this point, about 90 murals all over the world, and I work in a participatory way, so we'll talk a little bit more about that, but whoever I'm working with, wherever the mural goes, the whole process from planning until finish is really deeply embedded in that community. So for example, this is a mural at a public school in Brooklyn that is 100% children with special needs. So they wanted to paint this after the pandemic, and 100% also children from living below the poverty line. So they come from all over the city to go to this school, which is a really wonderful place. And the kids wanted to show how during COVID, because they really came from the communities who were most profoundly impacted by COVID, how they were brave. And the teachers and the paraprofessionals, the support staff, they wanted to show how they were loyal and protective, and how, kind of like a ball pit, no matter what changes were happening underfoot, they were keeping the ground steady for their students. So I do a lot of workshops, kind of teaching workshops. I was a public school teacher for about 14 years, and I do a lot of workshops to kind of draw out the imagery and figure out how it is that the people who occupy the space want to tell their own stories, because at the end of the day, I'm going to leave the area, although this one is my neighborhood, but typically, like this one is, this one is in a different neighborhood in Brooklyn, and what I would hope is that the people who created the image really feel like that they're represented their community. So the reason I kind of came to this, when I was an undergraduate, I had gone to college in Indiana thinking that I was going to be a social worker. I had no art practice, I had no art background. You know, I came from a family full of artists, but I felt like they had set the bar really high, and I felt a lot of pressure, so I thought I would pursue social work. And the town I grew up in was built around this factory. So this is a GM truck and bus factory in a town called Lake Orion. And I grew up in the 80s at a time where in Michigan in particular, but all around the country, there was immense anti-Japanese sentiment. So that's where we lived. You know, these were the bumper stickers that were on my high school classmates' cars. This was Vincent Chin, who was murdered when I was 6 years old because some factory workers thought that he was Japanese, and that was the climate. And I had a teacher who one day on the anniversary of Pearl Harbor when I was in 7th grade, he said, Katie, why don't you tell you're Japanese, why don't you tell the class what happened today in history? So first of all, problematic. So, but I told him about, and I told the class about my family, you know, and I told them about my great-grandfather, Anko Hirashiki, who on the night of Pearl Harbor was arrested because he was part owner of a wholesale vegetable market. And so the FBI had what ended up being a 58-page file on him as a possible risk to national security, and how he was incarcerated at a military prison for about 4 months before joining my great-grandmother and my great-aunt in a prison in the desert in Colorado. And I told him that whole story and how they lost everything. My grandmother and my grandfather were in New York City at the time, so they weren't incarcerated, but I told them that whole story in the class, and then when I was done saying it, my teacher looks at me and he said, that never happened. And I thought, like, I was in 7th grade and I was like, yes it did. And he was like, no it didn't. And I was like, yes it did. We went back and forth, but I wasn't raised necessarily to argue with my teachers, you know, and so there were no books, you know, there were no books in our library that said anything about this. You know, it was not taught. And as much as it was such a racist statement, I also believe that he might not have known about it. You know, so it was a product of this whole system. But what I also knew was that I had a really famous grandfather who was Japanese American. He was the chief architect of the World Trade Center. So a lot of people knew about him, right? And that was the whole reason we lived in Michigan in the first place. Because when we were growing up, I was like, why do we live here? Like, people hate Japanese people here. But, you know, so I kind of knew, you know, all of these things that people said about Japanese people, I knew, you know, just from my own family. We know our own families, right? We know the truths about ourselves and our families. And I knew that it wasn't true, you know, and so I kind of locked all of these stories. I locked away kind of how my teachers would say to my parents at conferences, like, she's smart and her siblings are smart because they eat fish, you know, stuff like that. Like, that they actually said, I kind of put it away and thought, you know, maybe something someday, but I didn't consider art. And then when I got to college, I started drawing. And I wish I had put some photos of my drawings, because it would have made every single person in here feel like you too can become an artist. Because my drawings in college, I started and I'd never taken drawing before, and it wasn't like, I wasn't a kid who drew all the time. But I loved how it felt. Like, I loved how it felt to look differently at things and look for light and shadow and look for texture and look at the form of something. And I liked it more than I was embarrassed by the work I was putting up on the wall. I didn't care. I was like, okay, well, this is the worst drawing in the class, but I love making it. So I kind of just stuck with it and thought I would pursue children's book illustration. And I found a program for graduate school eventually. But my second day of graduate school was 9/11. And so then this was awkward I lived in New York City. This was my grandfather's, like, the buildings he was most known about. People had a lot to say about the buildings. And then what happened was we watched, you know, these buildings, if you ever get to know his architecture, these are not what he was known for, not what he was regarded for, not what he set out to do in the world. He made beautiful buildings, and then he made the World Trade Center. Okay, so they were complicated in our family story too, but when that happened, all of a sudden, this symbol of our grandfather became this piece of pro-war propaganda for a war that none of us were behind. You know, and so it was really powerful for me, just starting out my kind of graduate program, to have this feeling of, you know, what do we do, what do people do with the art that we make, right? And how can we be really clear about what we put into the world? So I kind of started thinking back to my younger self. I was a self-identified ravenous reader. And this was, we had choices, and this is the one that I picked. And I was serious about my books, as you could tell. But you know, I didn't have the books that I wanted when I was a kid. So the book that's in the show that we have here is Fish for Jimmy, and it's kind of a historical fiction based on a family story where when my grandfather's uncle was incarcerated, his young son, stopped eating in the camps, and so he would sneak out of the camps and go fishing in the mountains for him, so to get his son to eat. His son was like 3 years old. And so I fictionalized it. I made it between two brothers. And the most satisfying thing, one of the most satisfying things in my career was that book ended up in a textbook, which somehow with that, it just felt so official, you know, and I wish I had the address of that teacher to send it to, but I don't. But you know, and I also thought about people like my grandpa, and I thought about why are there no books about people who have done these other things, you know, in our library. The library that was a part of my schools growing up, they were shameful, you know, for their representation. They didn't even try, and what I knew was that, like, his story of, you know, being, you know, growing up in Seattle, being at the top of his class, and you know, all the way up, and then never being able to get a job, so having to go and work at the canneries in Alaska to be able to pay for college. Those are not uncommon stories, right? Like, these are stories that are relatable in so many ways. Maybe not everybody went to the salmon canneries in Alaska, but so many people have versions of this story, and I think that the biggest story that I kind of wanted to communicate with his biography, which came out last year, was just, or 2 years ago, was just that there's a weight that, in particular in this country, people of color carry, that is, you have to do so much extra to prove your humanity. You know, he grew up at a time where he wanted to kind of make these aspirational spaces, and what he had to do when he graduated was to work in a cannery like this, that, you know, 18-hour days, to make people wealthy who were kind of hiring all these Japanese Americans and Filipinos. He had the capacity to build buildings like this. This is in Seattle World's Fair. But the spaces that were being built for his people was this, you know? So when people's humanity is stripped away and people are kind of pushed to the periphery and pushed to the margins, these mentalities and kind of like this way of translating who people are can really run rampant. We see it a lot today, right? If the propaganda shows Japanese people as not even human, it's a lot easier to make them disappear. You know, and from this is kind of the work I've been embedded for a long time, and it's been kind of translated for me into the present day of mass incarceration. And so my first time working at a prison was in 2009, I think, in Chiapas in Mexico. And this was a women's prison where if you have a child who's under 4 years old, they come to the prison with you unless you have somebody else who wants to take that child. And so I started thinking a lot about, like, who gets to tell the stories about other people, right? And so when I went in there, the people from the prison, it was very just good luck for me that I got to go in. Somebody I knew in this residency was doing gender workshops in the prison, and so she said, do you want to come and do a mural? And they had wanted me to do a mural with, like, Disney characters, because this was the play yard where the kids play. And so when I got there, I started speaking with women, and by the way, like 75% of the women in there were there for an issue of domestic violence and of self-defense, you know. And most of the women, probably all the women, their first language was not Spanish. Some of them didn't even speak Spanish, because Chiapas is a state where there are 26 indigenous languages spoken, so their access to legal support and representation in their language was non-existent. So that whole stereotype of like being stuck in a Mexican prison. That's like a very real thing. But we kind of went through and just talked about like, I only had 1 week, but it was, what do you want painted on here? You don't have to come in and paint a bunch of Disney characters. What do you want to paint? And so what they wanted to do was tell their story. They wanted to kind of show, talk about their trauma, and then talk about what they hope for the future. And so much of prison is time, right? It's how much time you have to spend, how much time you have to wait, and what you can do with your mind during that time. So this was the first one that I did, and then when I came home, I was thinking a lot about, all of the incarcerated, people impacted by incarceration, like locally, near where I lived. So I started working at Rikers Island. I did like a Kickstarter campaign, and I linked up with a nonprofit I was familiar with who did a lot of domestic violence workshops in different correctional facilities. So I was able to do a workshop that lasted for several months at Rikers, where we were kind of designing a mural for their children, but it ended up being like almost daily workshops where the women were we were talking a lot about how do we strengthen that bond, because there's a lot of evidence that if you are able to maintain or strengthen the bond between a parent and child during a time of incarceration, then the rates of recidivism drop. Of course there are a lot of factors for that, but the first day I was in there, we did these postcards for the kids. So one of the moms, she traced her hand and then she wrote this: "When you feel lonely, place hand here." And then she said, "Katie, can you take this to my sons so that when they miss me, they can put their hand on top of my hand and feel connected?" And I thought, like, what better use of a drawing? I've never heard of a better use of a drawing. And that drawing was super impactful, but all of the artwork that came out of these sessions was really breathtaking. And I think that so often people who are incarcerated, their story gets flattened. Right, you become incarcerated and all of a sudden you're referred to as inmate so-and-so, or by a number. And even on the outside, one of the first things people will know about you is that you were incarcerated. Not that you play soccer, not that you like fresh bread, not that you are a dancer or that you used to sing the song to your kid when they were little. They just know that you committed a felony, or that you committed a misdemeanor, or that you were just locked up for actually no reason whatsoever. So, making art inside, what I realized, because I've been teaching art, to children outside for about, I altogether was about 14 years, but I've never found a place that was where it was more useful. People come to those workshops and are like desperate to express something, and desperate to have a kind of human experience where you're used in a lot of jails and prisons. Your sensory experience is really under assault, right? What you're hearing, what you're smelling, what you're seeing is pretty stripped down. So these workshops have been pretty useful. And then they designed this mural that their kids painted. This is in East Harlem. And so all the imagery from the art workshops went into this mural. And then of course the kids, they wanted to design a mural for their moms too. And I will tell you that if you've ever done like youth development work, like organizing children who have a parent who have a mother who's incarcerated is so hard, because it's the mom who does all this stuff. But so the kids wanted to design a mural. They wanted to kind of process their own experience, and so we went through a similar process with them, and then this is part of a mural. It's a really long hallway, but this was the best shot I could get across from the nursery at Rikers. If you have a baby under 1, the baby stays with you. If you have a baby while you're incarcerated, the baby stays with you in the nursery until they're 1. By the way, in this group, I would say about 14 women in the group, and 75% of them would not have been there had they been able to pay a bail of $5,000 or less. And many of them were there for many months and sometimes years. So when we hear about bail reform, that's what we're talking about, because these are their kids who are home without their moms. And, I think a big part of this project was how do we lower the stigma, lessen the stigma that impacts so many kids who have a parent who's incarcerated. Maybe they have a teacher who doesn't quite know how to talk about it. And so being out on the street, painting this mural, people would come by and say, "Katie, can you take my picture in front of the mural, show the moms so they know when they come back into the community, we're here to support them." So this was a very impactful project. It was working with the Department of Corrections is very challenging. Logistically, you can imagine the red tape. So it was like a year of administration and then like 3 weeks of painting on the inside and 3 weeks of painting on the outside. The workshops on the inside went on for a long time, but it was very impactful and kind of just has led me down this other road. And this was an exercise I did with a group of teenage boys who were incarcerated in Philadelphia, outside of Philadelphia. And so I thought about this a lot when I've been thinking about my own family around the time of World War II and all that propaganda. But you know, this is the same 16-year-old boy. We said, how do you see yourself? Like, who are you in the world? He said, get good grades, compassionate, humble, responsible, great kisser, good at all sports, a good listener, kind-hearted, peaceful, all these really positive things, right? He knows himself. Okay, and then if you're in your community, this was South Philadelphia, or if you're, you know, out in the world, how do people see you? Dumb, ugly, not gonna be anything crazy, scary, bully, killer. And as we know, this difference is so dangerous to these young people, right? So they wanted to do a project. This was kind of a year-long project where we were looking at racism, you know, and different how it's impacted different groups throughout American history. And one of the projects we did was around the Japanese incarceration. So we mapped out on the floor a barrack, the measurements of a barrack, and we talked to them about if this were to happen to your family, like you had, you know, 6 hours or maybe 5 days, you had this amount of time to pack up your stuff, you get your suitcases, and then you have to go. How would you set up in this barrack so that your family would feel as much like home as possible? And so one of the boys, who was 15, he built this little barrack, and then he talked about how his mother's favorite color is red, and that his baby sister likes pink and gold, so he made that curtain. He talked about like his little brothers and what colors they like and where everybody would be comfortable sitting, and the tenderness that he had in designing this home and designing this barrack and making this untenable situation feel like home, I found to be so moving and also just so profoundly at odds with how he is identified in the world. Right, so what we did was we used this product called Polytab. Some of you might be familiar with it, but it's like a mural material. It's like a cloth, kind of feels like a dryer sheet. You can paint on it, take it anywhere. This was inside of the facility with the boys, and then adhere it to the wall, and it looks like a mural. So this is in a playground in South Philadelphia. It's actually much bigger than it looks. It's about 70 feet long, and they wanted the guys in the group just wanted to say, like, I'm smart, I'm responsible, kind-hearted, all of these positive words. They also wanted to challenge the viewer. If the viewer says, is he compassionate? Is he outspoken? Is he serious? Then kind of encourage the viewer to ask themselves, like, why am I doubting this? I don't know this person, right? So in my picture books, a lot of my books have similar themes. This is a book called Dad Bakes, and it's about a dad who works as a baker side by side with other bakers, and kind of how he spends the day. These are all acrylic on canvas. How he spends the day with his daughter, and it kind of the backstory that is hinted at in the beginning of the book, and then talked more about at the end, is that he was incarcerated, and this is them reconnecting, and it's about how they spend their time together. You know, the kind of passage of time. And then this is my most recent book, which is called Place Hand Here, and it's inspired by that hand. You know, I think that the woman who created that drawing, I lost track of her and haven't been able to find her again, but I do my best to kind of carry her story and share her story because it's so relatable, this feeling of missing somebody, right, and longing for somebody. And it's about a boy who pays attention to all the people in his home who put their hand on the wall and talk about who they're missing. Right, the kids from his class who are missing, like their dad who went to work down south for the season, because and he painted it because he knows that his mom, like, that she's thinking of him and holding him close, and until she comes back. And one of the kind of great joys of this work has been able to share these books with lots of people who are impacted by incarceration. So this is actually at an upstate prison in New York on a family day. And it is kind of just the type of thing where I wish there were no prisons. You know, I wish that there was a way to have more restorative justice and to not cause more harm But while there are prisons, there are families who are so impacted. So these books, I hope, are making a difference. And this is, some of you may have heard of Homeboy Industries out in Los Angeles. It's the biggest gang rehabilitation program in the world, actually. But they do tons of work, reentry work, including the bakery. So they were my kind of partners on this book, and they talked to me a lot about also the transformation of tattoos when people have, especially in LA, really extensive, complex gang tattoos, and then how, when they come out of that life, how the tattoos can transform. So there's a kind of transforming tattoo theme in that base as well. But yeah, I think that my biggest goal with all of this work is to kind of shine a little light into the margins, you know, into where places where people aren't necessarily seen quite as clearly, so that hopefully we can all see each other a little bit more clearly and speak with each other a little bit more honestly and open-heartedly. So that's it. Thanks.
I think we should turn the lights back on.
Yes.
Yeah, it's
You push
it's
the
over
right.
there. It's
There's so many buttons.
What,
Thank you.
Should we sit up here with you?
Yeah.
Grab the mics?
Sure, let's work it.
Testing. Hi. Good evening. Well, that was a great presentation. Don't you guys think? So, welcome to our panel discussion featuring two incredibly talented children's book illustrators. Now you guys know Katie and Melissa. I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to moderate this discussion. Throughout their presentations today, we've had a chance to delve into their creative process, their inspirations, and stories behind their illustrations. And now I'm hoping that we can explore how they navigate the dynamic landscape of children's literature, collaborate with authors, and use their art to address important themes and engage young readers. So without further ado, let's get to the discussion. So this is a question for both of you, Katie and Melissa. Can you tell us about your journey into the world of children's book illustration? Specifically, like Melissa, when you were on track to get your PhD in linguistics. And then I know it was like a lifelong dream as a child, but like why specifically children's book illustrations? So, you know, there are other forms of ways to tell stories, like there could be graphic novels or what was specific about children's literature that draw?
Well, yeah, specifically for me, it has always been picture books, which are for young kids. Usually, my picture books tend to be for kids age 3 to 7, and I think it's because that was the period in my life where I really leaned heavily on my books for just an escape into this, like I was saying, this world where I felt safe because I felt so intimidated by everybody, or so kind of fearful, and I was naturally shy, but I think it was also just where I grew up. There was nobody who looked like me. It's a rural California town on the Central Coast. And so I always kind of felt a little bit like an outsider, and I just didn't want anybody to really look at me. And I had a lot of anxiety about that. And as I was saying, the books really comforted me, and I think that was something that just stayed with me. And I always wanted to participate in that.
Yeah, I completely feel the same way because I legally, I still am labeled a resident alien. Yeah, and so that word alien, you know, as a kid, it sounds like green monsters with googly eyes. But that was my like official immigration status. And in addition to that, not being able to see any sort of books, and I was also a huge avid reader. Yeah, that was kind of a way to sort of become more invisible or more like an outsider. That sort of experience of not being able to see any form.
Right. I
Yeah.
think at the time I didn't notice that my books didn't have people who looked like me, but I also really loved books with animals.
Yeah.
Like Richard Scarry books, and you know the worlds that they created. I just remember wanting to go in and live in these worlds.
Right.
So.
Katie, what about you?
As I mentioned before, I wasn't really interested in pursuing art, and then when I started liking to draw, my aunt had this best friend whose name was Ed Young, and Ed Young is a very famous Chinese illustrator, amazing, but they had studied Tai Chi together, and they were both Tai Chi teachers from the 1960s. So she said, Ed needs somebody to come and catalog all of his work. So I had a very unusual opportunity to go to, stay with him and his family one summer and go through his, at that time, 80 books for children from beginning to end. And what he told me, which was really useful for me at the time, was that most of your drawings should be bad. And that was great news for me because all of my drawings at that time were bad. And he said, if all your drawings look great, then you probably aren't learning very much. So but it also, I had no interest in pursuing art at that time because I felt like I didn't know what to do with it, and I wanted to do something that was useful. I wanted to do something that would be useful in the world. And so when I saw his books, and I saw his books full of people of color and full of Asian people and telling stories that weren't really otherwise getting told, I felt like, oh, this could be good. I wasn't interested in the gallery world, and I felt like students, kids, parents, teachers, like those are my people, and that's who I wanted to make art for.
To go along with that, your background includes experiences as both a muralist and children's book illustration. How do these different artistic practices influence each other in your work? And especially in the beginning, were there any challenges kind of making that transition from, creating works that are 70 feet long?
I think for me, it always felt like they had a lot in common because it was telling stories. And the mural, of course, you've got one image to tell maybe a complex story. In a book, you've got like 15 spreads. But you said you have had one agent. I've had 3, and my first 2 really saw my mural work as kind of interfering with my book work. And so
How so?
just that it was taking up a lot of time, and it was just kind of like, they didn't quite understand the purpose, and my agent, who I've had now for the past several years, gets it completely. And I think that, the beauty of the murals, I didn't set out to do murals, I just didn't have a job. When I finished grad school, I couldn't sell a book, and so my friend's mom was a librarian at a public school in Jersey, and she said, why don't you come and paint a mural? And then that kind of just started to build momentum. But the murals have been the inspiration for so many of my books. Just knowing people and hearing different stories, and then finding out that these stories aren't told. Every day in America, there are more than 5 million kids who have a parent who's in a correctional facility. And where are the books for them, And so it's just learning more, about the breadth and depth of the world that we live in and that children live in all around. So I feel like they have been so connected.
This is, I'm sort of skipping ahead,
Okay.
but this is like connected to what you were just saying. In that respect, what kinds of stories or experiences do you wanna see more of in the industry today? And this is for
Yeah.
both of you.
I think, you know, I feel like since 2020, the picture book industry has opened in terms of like definitely hiring more authors and illustrators of color. There's way more representation. When I started, like, when you were going, it was like, you know, I don't remember the percentage of kids, non-white protagonists, but it was shameful. You know, it was less than 10%. Now it's much more, but I think what I would love to see more of are books that aren't necessarily like a book about the person's culture as much as a kid in the world, being a kid in the world and having their adventure. You know, like, I remember there being at a certain point a lot of like Cinco de Mayo books, and I was like, great, but like, where's the book where this character is just having a life as a kid? You know, Gigi No Gigi is a great example of those. Yeah.
364 days that are not
There's-
65.
exactly.
Yeah, I agree. I was gonna say the similar thing.
Yeah.
Like when I did Night Shift Daddy, which came out in 2000, there were not a lot of books with biracial
Yeah.
families,
Yeah.
and now there are more. There's
Right.
a lot more, and there's a lot more representation. So I would just like to see more of that, of course.
In like a deeper way,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Can I say one
And
more
like-
thing? Go ahead.
Oh, and I agree also, to show kids with different backgrounds just as, you know, Americans, because there's so many different, if you're American, you can look so many different ways, so having books that just have those characters in the book, but not necessarily about that.
Yeah, and I would just add like to include in there, beyond like race and ethnicity, like body diversity, gender diversity, more gender expansive characters, but not having the book be about,
that.
having it be incorporated like it is in our everyday lives.
Right. Like the adoption story. I mean, I feel like that book would have been very different if the story revolved around, you know, the process that the parents went through, or, you know.
Yeah, and the reason why I was inspired to do that is because I have a nephew who's adopted, and I never saw books with his story or with the character like him. And I didn't want it to be about adoption, but I just wanted to have a character like him in a book, so that was the inspiration.
So Melissa, you've illustrated numerous children's books with various authors, and you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation how you know, it would be boring if you were just illustrating the text, and it's the artist's vision of what that story is. How do you approach collaborating with or working with different writers, and is this different when you're working with your own manuscript? Like, what kind of process do you go through?
Well, like I said, for the most part, I don't work directly with the author. There have been cases, and I forgot to mention, actually, I have 2 picture books that I did with my husband, so of course, when I had no choice because I live with him, so I worked closely with him. But I've also had experiences where I illustrated nonfiction picture books. And in those cases, because there's a lot of research involved, and usually the author knows a lot, they've already done so much of the research, I would lean heavily on them sometimes, just find out if they had more information or who their sources were. So I have done that. But for the fiction books, I don't really work directly with them. And it's nice to meet them afterwards. I usually do meet them afterwards, even though I never met Eileen, sadly. But she wrote to me, so we did have that contact after the book was published.
So we have a lot of students here, so I'm going to turn the discussion over to some more professional development related questions. So first is like, what kind of advice would you give aspiring illustrators wanting to break into the industry? Or maybe more specifically, what did you specifically do to land your first book? Or what was the prep work for that?
As I mentioned before, I had all these one-off pieces in my portfolio, just single pieces, and I think it really, really did help to have pieces that showed a narrative, because I specifically wanted to get work illustrating a book. So one of the pieces of advice that I give artists is to definitely show the work that you want to get in your portfolio and have it be your best work. And if you're specifically interested in children's book illustration or writing for children's books, there's a organization called Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators that is really helpful for so many people I know. So many people started with that. It's just a way to meet people in the industry, and they have conferences and talks, and it's a really good way to educate yourself about the industry and meet people. So I would recommend that if that's what you want to do.
SCBWI.
Very good. I would also say, when you're making your portfolio, make work that you care about, you know, because that is, and about things that you care about. It really shows through. It also is motivating for yourself, because I think that if you have an urgency about the work that you're making because you feel like it needs to get out there for one reason or another, that will show, and you'll maybe make more work. Don't think about what other people might like, and honestly, you know, I feel lucky to not have kind of developed in a time of Instagram, because I know that that is really tough, because it's real that like people will hire you if you've got like 60,000 followers, or maybe you'll get a bigger contract or something like that. But at the end of the day, you have to just answer for how you relate to your own work, and I would say make work that you care about. And then another thing, and I didn't do this on purpose, it just happened because I didn't get paid for my work for so long. Have jobs that pay your bills so that you don't feel desperate to make art that you don't believe in. That's I mean, that's tricky. Like I don't begrudge any muralist who does like an advertisement. If you look in Williamsburg right now, it is nothing but glossy murals advertising luxury goods. Everybody has to make a living, but I would say when it comes to the work that you care about, just try to protect that a little bit.
And when you do that, you tend to enjoy the work,
Yeah.
and it shows.
Yeah.
And I think that makes a more powerful piece than if you were just trying to do something because it's trendy, or
Right.
you think it's going to be more commercial.
Yeah, it's tricky. Like I have had so many part-time jobs, like building my career, such a patchwork. But on the flip side of that, I never felt like I was making work that I hated. You know, so.
You both were talking more about agents. Did you have an agent, like, really as you started, immediately? Yes?
Yeah, I did. I had an agent right out of grad school, and I got zero work from it. I did get a couple lunches, but then I was like, I kept, that's the thing I kept counting on. Okay, if we can sell this book, then I'll have this money, and I can pay rent for this many months, and it never worked, you know. So then I kind of just got my other part-time jobs and patched together a way of having enough time to make work. You know, I don't know if that's the model. Like, I mean, obviously, some of you may be familiar with Yuko Shimizu, her work. She was my studio mate for 10 years. She's a very close friend. So, like, we have very different trajectories. Like, we got to the studio, and Yuko is all of a sudden, like, the most famous illustrator in the world, and I'm teaching at, like, 4 schools and doing murals, and, like, yeah, and working at a gym, you know. So, but it, you know, it's kind of like keep your eye on the long game, I think.
I was really fortunate because I really connected with this agent. I'm not with her, I'm with the agency. Her daughter took over, so I'm with her daughter. But and I had a full-time job as a web designer at an ad agency when I first started, because I didn't get my book for a couple of years, so it took a while. And I was doing freelance web design while I was getting started as well.
Oh, I have one other piece of thought on it. when it comes to like starting out after school, I would say look for unlikely partners. You know, I think that a lot of people graduate and then kind of go to the same art directors, the same galleries, the same even like arts nonprofits. But depending on what you're interested in, find a partner that might be able to support your work, who might not have already an arts leg, and like maybe build that with them. You know, maybe you want to do a project and they would be the right partner because it's like a LGBTQ center for teenagers or something like that, and they don't have necessarily like an arts wing, but you could be that person, right?
Yeah.
So I think think creatively about what the art world is, because the art world should be just the regular world, right? Like it's prisons, right? It's community centers, it's hospitals. So think about what you care about and then try to make that be your art world.
Yeah, or if you want to create your own illustrated goods shop, maybe partner with someone that has good business sense.
Oh, yeah.
Speaking of that, do you guys do any work outside of children's books, like, you know, selling prints or speaking engagements, like other forms of the art?
I do, well, a lot of school visits, a lot of author visits and book talks and stuff like that, and then I teach 1 day a week. I run an expressive arts program at a maximum security women's prison upstate New York.
And I've started, I guess in the past 5 years or so, I've started doing licensing work. And so I actually have a different agent, a licensing agent, and she shows my work to companies who are buyers who need artwork for things like paper goods or cards or
Plates.
things like that. I haven't done plates. Just done paper projects right now on calendars.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Yeah. How are we doing on
So
time?
it's 6:48, you wanna ask some questions and let's see if anybody in the audience has
Yeah. So I think this is a great time to turn it over to you guys. If anyone in the audience had questions for us. Yes.
First off, thank you both for being here. This is great. I had a question specifically about, you said you had 2 agents before.
Oh, yeah.
So I was
Great.
curious.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what happened? Why did you change? And
Great
any
question.
advice for somebody who wants to switch agents?
Okay, well, sure. The question is about agents and switching agents. I think that it's really good to like listen to your instincts if something is working or not working. So my first agent, I wasn't working for her, so they let me go. That was fine. I was not selling any books, so it made sense. They were getting a little smaller. It was all very amicable. My second agent I had for about 7 years, and we only sold 2 books in those 7 years. And it was the type of thing where I would send a message, and then I would not hear back for like 3 months, you know. And then when I ended that relationship, it went terribly. Even though the thing about an agent is that if it's not working for you, it's also not working for them, because they only make money if you sell a book, right? So that was it was a terrible ending, unfortunately. But it was also like, it also just needed to end, so that was okay. And now my agent, I love completely, forever, Tanya McKinnon. And so the thing about Tanya is that whatever I'm trying to do is not quite in the mainstream of picture books, and she completely understands all of it. And she's more in like academia, but yeah, it's, so working with her, I feel completely understood, and like she got me to her main work was getting me matched with my editor, who now I publish it pretty much exclusively with Norton Young Readers. So that was great. So now, but I think that if you feel disregarded or disrespected, or like if there's no response, and then that's maybe not a fit, you know. And you have to advocate for yourself, and it happens all the time that people change agencies, change representation.
Great, thank you. Yes.
Hello to both of you. I have a question as a future educator, especially for Kate. You said you were 14 years teaching. How was that experience for you? Were you like an art teacher or?
So my first year teaching, I did K through 8 Spanish in Detroit. My second year teaching, I was at a school that was going through a lot of changes, so I was hired to be the Spanish teacher. and a tutor for these kids were like professional dancers as part of the school. But then I ended up also being the humanities teacher because they fired the humanities teacher. I was also the guidance counselor because I was like, it was very illegal. Like the kids would come in and tell me their problems, and I would just listen. And then for the 12 years after that, I was an art teacher, and I was the public school that I worked at was partnered with a private ballet foundation, so all the kids were ballet dancers. So I was hired by the ballet foundation to be the visual arts teacher. So I was there only 2 days a week. So the first 2 years were full-time. And that was the most creatively exhausting, challenging, also fulfilling years of work. And then the 12 years after that were part-time. So I could do all my other jobs and try to make an art career. Yeah.
Me? Oh, yeah, I was curious if you guys ever tried self-publishing. Try like a print-on-demand service?
I haven't done that.
No, okay.
I think because I started so long ago, before that was even a thing,
Mm.
and, yeah, I've just been fortunate to continue.
Yeah, I haven't done it either, but I have a good friend named Zetta Elliott who did that a lot before her books kind of took off, and there's a freedom to that because you're the only cook in the kitchen, so you can, I like working with the publishing house because they do all the distribution and also like the editorial relationship. If it's good, it's really helpful, but there is definitely a freedom to self-publishing in terms of content.
I don't know very much about it, but AI, is there some concern about AI building on what you guys do and then claiming it, or AI taking the place of traditional illustration?
I don't think AI can replace what.
Yeah, well, currently, they don't have you can't copyright anything created by AI, and so in terms of publishing, I think that would be incredibly difficult, in terms of authorship or even monetizing it.
So illustrators are not gonna be using AI either, I mean, as another tool?
Well, if they do, because all they're putting in is like a prompt, and so the only creative aspect of that process, I would say, is the writing of instructing the model to, and so I think, or if they generate all of these images, maybe the creative output was them editing the images, like putting them in a specific order, but that's the extent of the creative.
Or manipulating them, like starting it with the AI and then putting it into, and then manipulating it that way, so that you're kind of combining the tools?
Sure, and I think that becomes complicated in terms of copyright, because it's kind of like taking a reference photo and then making it your own, which I think a lot of artists do.
Yeah.
I don't know, what are your thoughts on AI and the future?
Well, I'm just hoping that it doesn't get good enough. I don't think it could replace this kind of work, because it doesn't, children's books at least, it just doesn't feel like it has the humanity in it. And, for other things, I think it does really well, and it's kind of scary.
Yeah.
The way it can create photos of, people, and you can't even tell if they're AI or not.
Yeah.
But the most insidious thing that I found out recently is in Adobe products, because I work digitally. I don't create everything from scratch digitally, so it's a little different, but there was a thing you have to go into your settings if you use Photoshop. This is just a PSA. You can turn off this thing somewhere in settings with allowing them to use your work for research. They say, can we use your work for research? They're using it for AI, to teach the AI, and they could be using it to emulate your style or
Yeah.
something. So just make sure you turn that off. It's just the ways that you have to protect yourself. It's just,
Is that the same with Procreate or a tool like that, or is it only
I
with?
haven't heard about Procreate, but anything you post online is,
Right.
it
I don't think you
I-
remember.
Yeah.
Definitely isn't gonna do
Yeah,
it.
but I probably should educate myself. Yeah.
I think currently, there's so much uncertainty in terms of policy or laws or, you know, protecting, the intellectual property or even to see it as intellectual property. And I think that's something that, countries really need to, and I think there are already discussions happening in that regard. Yeah, but I don't, currently, I'm not very worried about AI taking
Well,
over.
Years ago, we had a illustrator here, I've forgotten his name, I'm sorry, who used to make quite a good living with the covers of adult books. And then before that, there were album covers, and a lot of that has shifted to not great art, digital, you know, I do a lot of audiobooks because I'm in the car a lot, and the little covers, you know, the images for the books, and they're not great illustrations, you know, and he was saying that his career had really been affected, and that was previous technical stuff that happened. And so, of course, now we've started to employ digital in illustration, but at the time, he was talking about it replacing what he had done. So that's, I was just thinking about that.
I feel like there's also like a flip side of that where, like, at least with YA and middle grade, I feel like they're having like a cover renaissance. Like the covers of a lot of YA books are so beautiful, and they're definitely digital and they're sleek and they appeal to young people, but I feel like the art on that, and it might just be like in the independent bookstore, like kind of narrow window, but I feel like there's also a lot of really good stuff being made, so maybe there's, yeah.
Yeah.
I think there was one more, yeah.
Hi, it's nice to meet you both and about your artwork. I was actually wondering about the process in terms of like the timeline and how long it takes to actually get your book out there, like all the stuff that you have to do throughout to like when you're making it, and even if you're writing it and illustrating, that probably takes even longer, and then like how long all of that takes combined, and then actually getting your book out there, like
It's a long time.
how long that whole
Yeah.
thing takes.
It's different for
Yeah.
all three of us.
I'm sure,
Yeah.
yeah. For
What about
me,
you guys?
I don't work digitally, so I might be the slowest. It takes me about a year to do a book, and then it takes them about a year to put it through production. But it has a lot to do also with the editorial side, because you end up sending stuff and then you often have to wait. But while you're doing that, like I finished a book in January, and now that's me like hauling the art to the publisher, and then they have to take it to get it scanned. And so I'm going in on Thursday to like review the scans and color correct. And then that book will be out in January 2025, but it's, in the meantime, you know, they're kind of like working on the case. There's a lot in the production side, but for me, the text is almost ready by the time I'm starting the illustrations. The text doesn't take as long, and then, it's like almost a full year for the illustrations. By the time I'm doing finishes though, it's probably like 6 or 7 months.
Do they actually tell you, we don't like this color, or you should change?
It's more like matching it to the original art, so it'll be, like the scans that they're getting,
Oh,
yeah.
okay, once it's going into production.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
Paper samples.
Right.
Yeah, it usually takes me about 9 months,
Uh-huh.
and the bulk of it is this is for when I'm illustrating other people's work, the bulk of it is doing the research and all the sketches and the preliminary work, and then my finals usually take about 3 months. And then there's also like Katie was saying, the back and forth of getting things approved at different stages. For the Gigi and OGG books, that was kind of crazy because I sold it as a 4-book series, and there was a really tight schedule, and they came one after another, and it was like 2 a year. So while I'm finishing one, I'm writing the other, so there was a lot of overlap. And often I'm juggling 2 or 3 books at the same time, but they're always in different stages. So I would never do a book where I'm doing finals for 2 books at the same time. You know, I could do finals for one and then start researching another, dividing it like that. So they're staggered.
Ooh, so after the one in May, is there like any plans for additional GG and OGG
I
books?
wish. Not now, but I'm working on it. I would love to do more of those books.
Yeah.
I have one question, if that's okay. Kind of like, I don't know. It kind of related to what you were saying about the like creative freedom process. I know if like you're freelancing, sometimes it's more about what the client wants, and you have to edit a lot of what you made. But since it's more about what you're trying to tell with your story, are you able to still like have most of what you want like drawn without it being without it being changed?
Yeah, I think so, yeah, I think so, like, mostly, I think like I feel like you're asking, like, there's a few parts to that question, and, mostly, like, my editor and the art director, that we're all kind of on the same page of like getting the image that best tells the story across, and so any changes are really small. A lot of the time it's like move this over a little bit, get that further away from the gutter, like make this a little bit bigger and push that back a little bit. And then in terms of creative freedom too, I think at different phases it means different things. Like I did a project when, there's the other piece of like, if you're a long-term deadline person or a short-term deadline person. Like, quickly, I worked with my two studio mates, Yuko and then John Hendricks. They both started doing a lot of editorial illustrations, so they had to do these like really quick turnover. I do not like fast deadlines. I'm like a long project type of person, so it's kind of like knowing your own personality. If you're somebody who likes to just really crank and work late and like that kind of adrenaline, like that is a great field. I knew just from spending like 2 months with Yuko that I was like, that was not gonna be my path. But she also, that's way more profitable. She didn't have to have all these other part-time jobs. So it's like, there's the trade-off.
Also, I think in different industries within art, there's different levels of freedom. And
Right.
one of the things that I love about trade picture book is you do have so much freedom as an artist.
Yeah.
And if you're doing advertising,
Right.
not so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah. They don't even put your name on it.
No,
Yeah.
but also
Right.
you're totally art directed and you're everything,
Yeah.
so many revisions.
Because everything is about how it's going to sell, whatever it's advertising. I think we're going to end with our last question.
Okay, this is mainly for Melissa, only because you mentioned that you did use Procreate. So I feel like when I was a freshman and sophomore, like a lot of professors are like, you can't use Procreate in like the professional world at all. And I see that you do use Photoshop after like using Procreate, and you do a lot of traditional stuff first anyways. But like, what is your opinion on that? And I feel like professors now are way more open to letting you use like Procreate and like Photoshop at the same time, or like whatever else you use at the same time. But like, do you think that somebody will actually like have a successful career if like, they're
When did
beginning
he
work-
say that?
Everybody
When did
uses
this really
Procreate,
be?
yeah.
Was this
Like
like
in the
when?
very early.
Oh no,
like,
when I was a freshman, oh my gosh, one of my professors was just like, you just don't use Procreate. You just don't use
Because I know
Procreate in this
people
class.
who've done complete books, entire
Oh,
books.
yeah.
Yeah,
Only
all the time.
in Procreate.
Yeah.
it's just another tool.
I would
Yeah,
say
it's just
yeah.
another.
there's just limitations
Yeah.
within Procreate in
Yeah.
terms of like layers, or a lot of editing is so, in my opinion, Photoshop is just a lot
Yeah.
easier. And so I think if you combine the two, it's great. I would say because of some of the limitations brought on by Procreate, that might be the only reason why someone might be like, that might not be the best tool. But if it works for you, I don't think there's any reason why you shouldn't. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just another tool.
Yeah.
All right.
So,
Well, thank you.
yeah,